Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, November 4th, 2019. I hope you had an awesome weekend and your week is off to a good start. Today, we are talking about pre-crime, what some people might call in the industry, the professionals want to call it predictive policing. I think it's Orwellian, very dystopian, and over the last few weeks, there have been a couple of new announcements coming out of Washington, D.C. about more unconstitutional federal involvement in local policing. Keep in mind, the police powers, that is, the large mass of powers that were not delegated to the federal government under the Constitution or in the Constitution, the very few and defined powers that James Madison talked about in Federalist 45, almost everything was not delegated to the federal government, was reserved to the people of each state. That includes local policing and day-to-day criminal investigations. Now, we're talking about these two new proposals today. Or maybe it's more than a proposal, really. It's a minority report kind of style pre-crime approach to mass shootings. And if we understand the mentality of never letting a crisis go to waste, we know that every single time a tragedy happens, whether it's from foreign actors, domestic, terrorists, criminals, whatever, unless, of course, it's politicians, then government is always going to use that as a way to restrict your liberty even more, get involved in more things it shouldn't do because people are afraid. John Adams, back in 1776, I've been citing him more and more lately in his early days when he was really good. I should really focus on that a little bit more. But he told us that fear is the foundation of most governments. And as I said in my speech to the Mises Institute's annual Supporters Summit a little over a week ago, there's only one word I would remove from that, and that's most. Fear is the foundation of government. And as Adams told us, he said that same fear would cause people to be stupid and miserable. And because they're afraid of something all the time, they're stupid in going to government, the government that uses the fear to oppress people and give it more power. So these two new things are really kind of looking to a pre-crime approach to mass shootings and then a federal police surge. Both of them are kind of undefined, so there's some gray area, but I think we can connect the dots and see how bad it could potentially be. Anyways, I'm going to cover that in this episode of Path to Liberty. I'm grateful for you joining me. My name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. We broadcast live on video through Facebook, YouTube, DLive, Periscope, and Twitch. Hopefully, we'll be able to add that to places like Brighteon.com and BitChute and BitTubers, which we publish the archive video versions. We also have a podcast-only, audio-only edition that we publish through iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and elsewhere. I'm grateful for all the reviews that have been coming in, especially on iTunes. If you haven't done so yet and you love what we're doing, 5 stars. If you hate, of course, not 5 stars, but hopefully I'm doing a pretty good job in keeping this interesting. Find all of our archives, all the ways to follow us. A lot of the links that I mention in the shows will be in show notes for each individual episode. The social media channels, the way to subscribe to our newsletter, to support us financially through our membership program. All of that's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. It's a long, fully spelled out, but you could also Google just Path to Liberty podcast, and it should pull it up for you pretty quickly. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And again, I hope you guys had a really good weekend. I'm very excited to be joined by you today. I really think, actually, every single time I do this show and I look over at the live chat, I think it is really cool. When I first started this organization, I bought the domain name 10thamendmentcenter.com back in mid-2005. Man, I can't even add it up anymore. Somewhere around there. 2006, actually. 2006 it was. I was thinking, I am sick and tired of the Bush administration, supposedly run by these limited government conservatives that talk about the Constitution and things like that. violating the Constitution at every turn. So I'm going to blog about it and point out how these people are full of crap, and whether it's the Patriot Act or the Real ID Act, the war on drugs, foreign policy, all these things, they're always violating the Constitution. And it's not just the right, it's also the left. No matter who's in power in Washington, D.C., they generally like to use the Constitution to support their proposals when it supports their proposals. And then they ignore it or treat it like total trash. They say it's outdated when it doesn't fit. And the opposition always does that too. It doesn't matter who's in charge in DC. It's the same thing. The Team A versus Team B, they love the Constitution when it fits their ideals. So I always thought it was just amazing, because my goal when I started the site was hopefully just to reach a couple of people, one or two people, a handful of people, and point out that this is just the truth. I was just going to blog in my spare time and write about stuff. But more and more people started following our work, and our team grew and grew over time, and here we are today. And I have the same kind of feeling when it comes to this show. So I started the show early or mid 2018 with the idea that, you know what, I've got all this equipment, I have some know-how, and I sure can blab, and I thought it would be good to share some information with people with the hopes that someone's interested. But since then, we've expanded the platforms we're on, and we're now actually, the number of views and listens that we get is up somewhere between 8 and 10 times in just over a year. So we're growing, not super fast, but very steady and consistent. So all of you who are liking, sharing, commenting, leaving reviews, all that stuff is helping us spread the word. 8 to 10 times as much as when the show first started, summer of 2018. So that's my long rambling intro. Thank you for being here with me. I want to say hi to some people out in the live chat who I love seeing. It's way more than one person every single time. Will and Steven over on Facebook. EHP Training, good to see you, along with Heather Rossi, Lady Liberty, Larry Clark, Tyler, Calvin, Essential Freedom, and everyone else over on YouTube. Richard Kramer, good to see you as well. Hope you're doing well over there, Richard, over on YouTube. Thank you for joining me again today. And again, whether you're watching live or in the archives, comments and feedback mean a lot. Not only does it give me ideas. I've gotten a lot of show ideas from people leaving comments, asking questions, and then recognizing like, oh man, I did not do a good job of covering blank. I should do another episode on this particular thing. But it also, again, triggers the algorithms of the platform that you're watching or listening on. So all those comments help out a lot, even if it's just a quick hello. And hi to Bob Brewer as well. I'm so grateful for all your support and feedback, Bob. Anyways, let's get into this and talk about this. First of all, I want to point out that I did an episode in August, a couple of months ago, on pre-crime and predictive policing. At this point, I was covering something called the TAPS Act. This is a bill that was, I think the guy's name is Babin, someone in the Imperial Congress had submitted this piece of legislation to, in essence, and there was a lot of warning I saw on very friendly websites to our work. I saw a lot of warning talking about how this particular TAPS Act, Behavioral Threat Assessment, was going to create a kind of a dystopian pre-crime system for the entire country, federal, state, and local. And I went through that legislation pretty detailed overview on that episode, and although the legislation itself does not do the alarming things that a lot of people were saying that it does, it certainly does set the stage, and I think it gives a very clear indication that this is the type of thing that a lot of people in Washington, D.C. actually want. So if I did a good job on that episode, and I'll have it linked in the show notes if you haven't seen it yet, or if you have, maybe go back and let me know if I did an okay job on it. I hopefully explained that even though the legislation at this stage wasn't creating the things that we're fearful of in the future, it sets the foundation and it creates a scenario where it's almost going to be automatic should it pass. And then it also is that indicator that a lot of people in DC really like the idea of pre-crime. And I'm going to cite my buddy Joe Wolverton over at the New American from JBS talking about the problems with arresting people for pre-crime, things that they haven't done, for example, detaining them. Now, that bill is still sitting in committee. I don't think it's gone anywhere. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere right now. A lot of people are distracted with other political things. I guess in a way that's very positive. The more that they're distracted investigating one person or another, the less that they're passing more garbage to attack your liberty. So we don't want Washington, D.C. to pass anything more at this point because there is no indication that they will reduce the size of their own power or the scope of the government that they are running at this point. But even though that piece of legislation, the TAPS Act, hasn't moved, it might. We now have a new memo from Attorney General Barr that seems to be pushing pretty much the same thing. And this is, again, this is H.R. 838. This was the TAPS Act that I talked about in that episode. If you're watching on video here, again, I'll have that link in the show notes. It's to develop a national strategy to prevent targeted violence through behavioral threat assessment and management, and for other purposes. The idea of taking action to figure out who might commit a crime and then prevent that action really is a massive dragnet, the stuff of dystopian sci-fi. That will never happen here kind of commentary. But this is pending legislation, and even if it never goes, this is the type of thing that is being proposed in Washington right now in our life today, not some future book from Philip K. Dick or someone else. It is being proposed today, and it's very, very dangerous in my mind. So here's the new thing coming from William Barr. This was just on October 23rd. I think the memo that he sent out was the middle of the month. But here from Reuters, U.S. Attorney General William Barr on Wednesday announced a new effort to prevent mass shootings through court-ordered counseling and supervision of potentially violent individuals. So someone who might be violent, again, rather than, this is the same mentality for gun control, the same mentality for plant control, for drug prohibition. People are basically being treated as potential criminals or in need of counseling for things they might do rather than what they have done. And that goes against the entire system that is supposed to help protect liberty, or it goes against the principles of liberty is really a great way to put it. So going on in this report, Barr said a training conference at FBI headquarters in December will consider new ideas to face threats, such as enlisting psychologists and community groups. And you can read through this whole thing. I think the article from Reuters certainly sounds kind of, it's, if you're not already understanding how things are, the average person reading this is like, oh yeah, well, there's all kinds of problems out there. I've heard some politicians or some talking heads that I support mentioning a lot of these people have mental illness. I think it is certainly, even if they can't be clinically declared mentally ill, anyone who goes around and murders a bunch of people is mentally ill. Anyone who demands that other people murder a bunch of people is mentally ill. So I guess every politician really is mentally ill as well, but that's its own episode. So I think the average person reading this is probably thinking relatively positively about this. Like, okay, I don't like that administration in there, and this Barr guy sounds awful, but you know what? At least he's trying to bring a reasonable approach on this. And here's the link to the entire memo here. Again, I'll include that in the show notes because I know the resolution is pretty bad on it. Everybody who scanned it and shared it around. It's on a bunch of websites now, but you can kind of dig in and probably zoom out and find a really good resolution to see this. But here's what Ron Paul, and I don't have this up. I just got an email forwarded to me this morning. I'm not sure when Ron sent this out. This came through his Campaign for Liberty organization. And this is how he put it. President Trump and Attorney General William Barr think they found a way to give support for red flag gun confiscation orders a boost in Congress. In announcing a new plan allegedly designed to stop mass shootings before they begin, Barr declared he wants to, quote, apply the lessons learned from the war on terrorism, and Ron calls it the failed war on terrorism, to, quote, disrupt individuals who are mobilizing toward violence. Now, certainly you don't want people to commit violence. I'm I'm not saying somehow people who are going around shooting people should be like running free and shooting people. Certainly, if the right to keep and bear arms were really exercised the way that the founders thought it should be, that the average people had military-style weapons, one single person trying to take out a bunch of people, the odds of someone taking out that person goes way up, rather than relying on government to monitor everyone and to detect who might actually cause problems in the future. And Ron put it this way in his email: this is just one more step towards thought crime. Who do you think is going to be targeted by this new pre-crime scheme? How long will it be before politicians declare certain cultural, political, or religious beliefs crimes that make people like you and me targets? Now, it could be people who have views similar to you or I, but it could be people who have views that we don't like. I don't want to treat someone who has a bad view, a Bernie Sanders, as a criminal for his views. But there are certainly some people on one part of the political spectrum that want to do that. They would love to lock him up. And then in response, you get the other side saying, well, now lock him up. And everybody wants to lock everybody up for things that they say rather than crimes that they commit. The amount of nonviolent people in being prosecuted for crimes is just insane. Ron Paul goes on in his email. He says, it wasn't that long ago that a Missouri fusion center, and I've covered fusion centers repeatedly on this show, affiliated with the Department of Homeland Security, issued warnings that anyone with my presidential campaign's bumper stickers was a potential domestic terrorist. Potential domestic terrorist. And then he says, you know, under programs like what Barr is describing, our veterans will likely be the first ones disarmed through red flag gun confiscation schemes and so-called universal background check proposals like H.R. 1112, which has already passed the House. So I think Ron Paul, it's very good to hear that he's sounding the alarm on this. Hopefully I can add to that a little bit or just kind of back that up and help amplify that message, because it's incredibly important to note what is going on. Here from Mint Press News. This was on October 25th. Whitney Webb published this last Wednesday. U.S. Attorney General William Barr issued a memorandum to all U.S. attorneys, law enforcement agencies, and top-ranking Justice Department officials announcing the imminent implementation of a new, and this is what they call it, National Disruption and Early Engagement Program aimed at detecting potential mass shooters before they commit any crime. I mean, for those of us who've read Philip K. Dick's Minority Report short story, seen the film that it was based on, we understand what pre-crime is. It is stopping people from doing something before they do something. It sounds nice in concept. Oh, no one wants someone to get hurt, but there's no way to know every person who's going to commit a crime, and there's no way that it's not going to be a vast majority of people who are never going to commit a crime being monitored and surveilled and stopped. Per the memorandum, Barr has directed the Department of Justice and the FBI to lead an effort to refine our ability to identify, assess, and engage potential mass shooters before they strike. Sounds like more mass surveillance. Sounds like a lot more mass surveillance for everyone. And if you say the wrong type of thing, well, maybe a psychiatrist thinks that you're dangerous. I know anti-government is considered to be, I don't know if it's in the DSM, the diagnostic and something manual that psychologists use to determine pathological traits and things like that, disorders and the like. From my understanding, anti-government is being included in this type of thing. I mean, I'm definitely anti-government. I'm pro-liberty, and government at its very basis, especially in this country, is incredibly anti-liberty, no matter who's in charge of it. So, yeah, that in and of itself should be alarming. Barr notes in the report, newly developed tactics used by joint terrorist task forces. I think it's very important to also point out that everything that they use overseas against the terrorists eventually come home to us. I've been talking about this for a long time. We talk about the drone program that was used in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and elsewhere around the world. Surveillance programs overseas, targeted killings overseas. Eventually, this type of power is always brought home. And James Madison warned us about this. I wish I had this quote handy, but basically he said the means of defense against foreign danger will always be used to take liberty at home. And that was just a paraphrase. I should probably look that up just to make sure I have it exactly right next time. But Madison warned us about this. This is always, he said, they've always been used to restrict liberty at home, the means of defense against foreign danger. And he said real or pretended. So even if there isn't a real danger, government will use the fear that John Adams was talking about of potential danger to take that liberty at home. So we can think about terrorism. They're concerned about foreign terrorists. Now, of course, it's domestic terrorists, or they're going to use the tools that they developed, that they expanded, and the things that they learned from going after terrorist subjects to go after everyday Americans. Barr notes that newly developed tactics used by joint terrorist task forces include the use of clinical psychologists, threat assessment professionals, intervention teams, and community groups to detect risk, and suggests that the new early engagement program will work along similar lines. Barr also alludes to this community approach in a separate instance when he writes that when the public says something to alert us to a potential threat, we must do something. This is the see something, say something approach post 9/11. But turned into kind of a Stalin-esque type of thing. Everyone is a snitch. They're afraid of everyone instead of actually understanding who your neighbors are. And, this is pot calling the kettle black, because here in downtown Los Angeles, I've often joked about how I'll know someone in another state far better than I know the person 6 feet away from me in the apartment next door. So in cities like this, it is very common to just not know who people are. And the less you know the people around you, the more likely you might be afraid of them. The less you know, the more you may fear. Someone isn't familiar to you. Well, of course, that's a suspicious activity. I'd better call it in. Now, I'm not going to do that because I'm afraid of law enforcement. I'm afraid of them figuring out that, or thinking like, oh, this is, maybe we need to take this guy in. I don't trust these people at all. So this is a mentality that Stalin loved. Stalin wanted everyone to be spying on everyone and reporting everyone. And you saw this in Big Brother in 1984, Orwell's great book, and the film that was made out of it as well. Going on in the report, Barr's recent actions suggest that the way this all is going to be accomplished, they're going to find new ways to determine intent. So they're going to somehow, algorithmically probably, and then also through these community groups, maybe they're going to label groups or individuals as hateful. Like, for example, I have had a profile on the Southern Poverty Law Center's Hate Watch pages, a full page profile. I know there's a lot of people say, oh, great that you've joined so-and-so. There's only 30 or 35 of us that have a full profile at the Southern Poverty Law Center under Hate Watch. So according to this organization, that organization, who sends that out to all law enforcement agencies around the country, state, local, and federal, I'm listed as a leader of potential hate for anti-government activities. At some point, don't you think that might be included in a threat assessment? This person is really rallying up the hate. Dangerous person. I don't know. But they're going to do this through increased mass surveillance of everyday Americans and the use of algorithms to analyze that bulk data for vaguely defined symptoms of mental illness. And I did an episode a few weeks ago talking about how all the things that we've been concerned about regarding NSA surveillance are really coming true today. A lot of people, even who oppose the idea of mass surveillance over the years, have told me things like, NSA is bad, but why don't you focus on something that really has an effect on people? They're literally just collecting stuff. They can't sift through all that information. It's just being stored there. Yes, it's a problem, but focus on something more immediate, like Obamacare. Like, let's work on that lawsuit to shut down the Affordable Care Act instead of this. And of course, my view is they're all bad. All of these programs, everything that violates the Constitution is bad. And some people are motivated by one thing over another. I happen to be motivated by opposing as much as I can, whether it's gun control, Obamacare, mass surveillance, drug war, unconstitutional wars overseas, and on and on and on. So a lot of people have said, they're just collecting this data. They can't use it. But the data is being used, and through algorithms, they're building profiles on people. And now we learn that the FBI is already using that NSA data in an illegal fashion that was collected illegally after claiming that they weren't. No one's ever going to touch this. It's just going to be the NSA for potential terrorists. Now the FBI has already been released. It's been, I think some documents were released to prove that they were doing this. And they've been actually using this for domestic policing already. And then if you tie that idea in with collecting everyone's data, everything that they say, jokingly or real, in public, in private, anything, online, they're listening, watching, and recording all of it. They can look for keywords, build a profile on someone, and then at some point they're going to analyze the bulk data for vaguely defined symptoms of mental illness. Going on in the report, Barr also suggested the likely courses of action that would follow the identification of a given individual as a potential mass shooter. The AG notes that in past cases, individuals deemed a violent or domestic or terroristic threat before they commit a crime are subject to detention, court-ordered mental health treatment, substance abuse counseling, electronic monitoring, among other measures. Ostensibly, the new program would then apply these same practices to individuals in the U.S. that federal authorities believe are, quote, mobilizing towards violence. That's Barr's words. If you're mobilizing towards violence, even if you don't do anything wrong, then, of course, you're dangerous. And who is going to be pointed out as a person who's mobilizing towards violence more than someone who owns the means to do violence, even if they don't? That would be a gun. I think this is the potential for a mass gun control effort. And when you have an NRA-backed president that is implementing more gun control than even Barack Obama did, who was a total gun hater, then I think you've got real problems when you put this all together. And I'm sorry if I'm rambling on this. This, I think, is just so important to cover. Here's my buddy Joe Wolverton over at New American. I mentioned that I was going to cover this if I can get to the report. My mouse. Okay. He had a report on this late last week. AG Barr quietly reveals plan to establish federal pre-crime unit. He says, promising to identify, assess, and engage potential mass shooters before they strike. He has committed the full attention of the U.S. government in his memo to preventing these types of attacks. He said there are several legal and constitutional impediments to AG Barr's planned pre-crime program. First, in the U.S., Joe writes, a person cannot be charged and tried for a crime unless mens rea and actus rea are established as facts. Pardon my Latin if I'm totally wrong. I learned from reading. He says mens rea and actus rea are critical elements of criminal law that have existed for centuries in American and English law. The terms are taken from the Latin maximum actus non facit reum nisi mensit rea. A person is not guilty of an act unless his mind is also guilty. Put simply, mens rea means a guilty thought and an intent to do something, and the actus rea is the act itself. So you can't just have guilty thoughts. There's a difference. Having guilty thoughts, thinking bad things. I know a lot of people want to have thought crime in this world, and sci-fi writers have warned us about thought crime for a long time. But this is putting it into practice. Joe goes on, he says, it should go without saying that the point of the necessity that the government prove that a person not only wanted to commit a crime, but that he actually committed that crime is a fundamental protection of the right of all people to be presumed innocent and to make it appropriately difficult for the government to arrest and jail people on nothing more than mere presumption. Or to say it as Barr wrote in his memo, to arrest and jail people who have done nothing more than mobilize toward violence. I think at some point someone is going to actually interpret this Barr memo. Thank you, Mr. Republican. This Barr memo, someone in the future, think Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, one of these people, are going to certainly look at buying a lot of firearms as mobilizing towards violence rather than sport, self-defense, personal interest, collection, whatever it may be. Who cares? I don't care why you own a firearm. It's none of my business. What matters is what you do. If you're a good person and you own a ton of guns, you're fine. If you're a good person and you own a bunch of illegal substances, that's fine. It's not what you own, but how you act with what you own or with yourself. Joe goes on, he says, later in the memo, Barr notes that the people who commit mass shootings typically exhibit symptoms of mental illness and or have substance abuse problems. This is another way of describing President Donald Trump's red flag program. Just like Ron Paul was saying, this really goes hand in hand with the idea of claiming that some people will potentially be dangerous, so therefore take away their right to keep and bear arms. And for those on the left who think that this is only going to be used for the right to keep and bear arms, you'll be amazed how creatively some people can think about how your access to banking or free speech or social media platforms can be restricted in the same way, because you might be calling for things that people on the opposing side might think are dangerous. It can go both directions. This isn't just about gun owners, I'll tell you that. It's about everything, really. And Joe sums it up like this. It should be obvious that such tyrannical efforts to stop crime before it happens should be opposed by all men who prefer liberty, no matter how dangerous, to a country where the government claims to keep people safe by stopping crime before it starts. Man, I think this is just nuts. I don't know how to sum it up properly, but really. And mind you, just last month as well, Mr. Attorney General Barr has been going around saying that social media platforms, I know a lot of people hate the social media platforms. In a way I do, but I also love them. And I know that the government is really pressuring them to do some of the worst things that they do. Barr is pressuring Facebook specifically to not have end-to-end encryption. This definitely deserves its own show at some point. Whether I am qualified to do that or not is another story. But end-to-end encryption means that the business intermediary, Facebook, I guess this is going to be someone can tell me if I'm explaining this in a good or a bad way. If you're using Facebook Messenger and it has end-to-end encryption, even if Facebook wants to, they can't access the content of your Messenger communication. Only from end to end. They have to basically hack you at your phone level or your computer level or on the other side. It's all encrypted, or unless they can break the encryption. And at some point, they definitely want to learn how to do that. But for the time being, Mr. Barr is telling social media companies, not just Facebook, but all of them, and technology manufacturers like Apple, you need to build in a back door to encryption, so law enforcement always has access. But that is almost like saying that in a private conversation between you and I, law enforcement can't have the encryption that is me speaking into your ear personally. It's got to have, I don't know, a telescreen in your room so government can figure out who is a criminal according to the government at all times. It's really just the same concept, but expanded writ large for every type of electronic communication around the world today. So he has been pushing this pretty aggressively to try to attack encryption and the ability to have private communications. I just wanted to point that out quickly. I'll include that link in the show notes. And then I also want to quickly talk about, I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit longer than normal again today, but this article that we published over the weekend from Mike Meharry. And for those of you who don't know, I know he probably doesn't want me blabbing too much, but his mother has been struggling with cancer, and so he is relocated on his own. He's left his wife and mother-in-law back in Kentucky, but he has been in Florida helping take care of his mother, and now he's in the process of moving his family to be down in Florida, but he's still, I don't know how he does it. The short version is Mike is going through some family struggles in the process of a multi-state move for his mother-in-law. His mother's getting cancer, and he still pounds out articles. Maybe it's cathartic, maybe it's therapeutic for him as well to talk about the things that are important to him. That's liberty. But he wrote this article that we published yesterday. A new surge expands unconstitutional federal involvement in local police. And I'm just going to briefly cover this because there really isn't a lot of details. But he writes it this way: invoking military language used during the Iraq War, President Trump announced a national police surge to crack down on violent crime. That's all I would need to hear. Because I know that there's really only 3 crimes that the federal government is involved in. And it doesn't involve things like murder, robbery, rape, theft, all the stuff that people may get charged for. This is something that's supposed to be handled on a state-by-state basis. And it can be different from state to state, depending on how they do things. And of course, he says, in the coming weeks, Attorney General Barr, this is what Trump had to say, will announce a new crackdown on violent crime, which I think is so important. Of course, violent crime is a problem. A lot of the violent crime, we have to also recognize, comes out of government-enforced prohibition. So when you talk about drug war crime and drug lords, that only happens because drugs are illegal. Or illegal gun running only happens because so many guns are illegal. And for those of you who don't think they are, you haven't read all the gun control bills that have been passed into law, and I put law in quotes because all of them are illegal in my view, either under a federal or a state constitution. But anyways, in the coming weeks, Attorney General Barr will announce a new crackdown targeting gangs and drug traffickers in high crime cities and dangerous rural areas. Trump, of course, did not offer details about the plan, writes Mike, but he promised it would be very dramatic. And this is, I think, the real important point that Mike makes. The federal government does not have any constitutional authority to engage in local crime fighting. That could be the end of the article. The federal government does not have any constitutional authority to engage in local crime fighting. Period. During the ratification debates, numerous supporters of the Constitution insisted that police powers would remain exclusively with state and local governments. But over the years, the feds have intertwined themselves more and more tightly with state and local law enforcement. We see all these different grant programs, joint terrorism task forces, joint drug war task forces. There's all these task forces where the locals are basically acting as federal agents, and then they're ignoring the local laws that they're supposed to be enforcing. Then again, most of these laws that are on the books, state, federal, and local, really shouldn't exist in the first place. So the less they enforce in general, I think, is better. But we're really seeing local police having been turned into a national police force in many ways, in my view. He says, this is what Mike writes, in effect, today the U.S. government effectively directs a national police force with policies and priorities dictated by Washington, D.C. State and local police operate at the behest of federal authorities, what the police unions call their federal partners. They are motivated by funds and equipment showered upon them by their Washington benefactors, and also asset forfeiture funds from Washington, D.C.'s Equitable Sharing Program. And he goes on, during his speech to police chiefs, Trump bragged about increasing the federal government's unconstitutional police militarization scheme. He said, to help keep you safe. Again, this is the fear. People are afraid of things, so they want government to keep people safe. Donald Trump's only job is not to keep us safe. It's not to make the economy great. It's to follow his oath to the Constitution. Same with everyone in Washington. Same with all the other people. Kamala Harris, senators, Rand Paul. It doesn't matter who they are. Their job is to follow their oath to the Constitution. Everyone else wants to tell us that their job is to make health care affordable or to protect us from foreign terrorists, to keep us safe, to fight crime, to fix the economy, all these different things. None of this is in their job description. It's literally to get the hell out of the way of almost everything and just follow the Constitution. He said he's made $600 million worth of surplus military equipment available to local law enforcement. If you remember, the previous administration didn't want to do that. They didn't want to make you look so tough. They didn't want to make you look like you're a threat. And Mike points out that the federal government has aggressively worked to arm local police through 1033. It's the 1033 Department of Defense grant program where they hand out all kinds of stuff. It's a socialist program where everyone has to pay through taxes for the equipment that's bought by the federal government for the military which is engaged in too many places around the world, and then the military ends up with surplus because they keep building new programs like the F-35, which is a multi-trillion-dollar waste of money. And then they have extra stuff, and then they hand that off to the locals. And then the locals, because a lot of their time they're doing federal enforcement jobs, gun control, prohibition, and the like, then they want this type of equipment and they become more and more aggressive. Instead of being police officers, they become federal agents. And Mike points out that police also get military equipment through the Department of Homeland Security via the DHS's Homeland Security Grant Program. In 2013, for example, DHS gave more than $900 million, $900 million in counterterrorism funds to state and local police. And according to a 2012 Senate report, this money has been used to purchase tactical vehicles, drones, and even tanks with little obvious benefit to public safety. I would argue that the federal grant program would be unconstitutional even without a benefit to public safety. So this is ongoing. It's growing. It doesn't matter which team is in charge in Washington, D.C. It continues to expand. Stephen RG over on Facebook says, even my little town PD got an MRAP. This is it's not a tank. A lot of people call them that. It's basically an armored, a lot of times it's a tracked vehicle. He says, when will that be used for anything other than martial law? Richard Kramer, good point. And I think I briefly recovered myself. He says, the problem arises from calling peace officers law enforcement officers. Law enforcement is a socialist term. Essential freedom, taxation is theft. We had a great post that we put on our social media yesterday afternoon over the weekend from a quote from John Dickinson. The headline that we included was just taxation is ... So check that out as well. Veritas vos liberabit. Great name. We the people are on our own. Better elect constitutional sheriffs and join a constitutional militia. And certainly, and I've covered this in the past, the founders wanted the people to have military-style weapons. And you didn't hear a lot of people talk about it as a way to fight a tyrannical government. And certainly that's part of it. But the primary talking point from the founders in the ratification debates and in Philadelphia and in the publication of the papers at the time was because if the general public was armed to the teeth, you wouldn't have much of a need for a big standing army, if at all. And they considered standing armies to always be dangerous. And if you're always relying on government to protect you, government is always going to continue to grow and find new things to protect you from. So it's on and on and on. Going on, taking a look at a little bit more in the live chat. Veritas also says Posse Comitatus. That's a good one. I've had a few people ask about that as well. Richard Kramer talks about Prince versus U.S. That is the major modern Supreme Court opinion, pointing out that the federal government cannot require local governments, state, local, to use resources or manpower to help enforce federal acts or regulatory programs. They are not required. They certainly do participate voluntarily all the time because the government steals so much money via taxation from us, and then they divvy out part of it after it goes through their bureaucracy. They divvy out part of it to the local governments, which continues their programs. Let's take a look here as well. Stephen RG says Facebook shares all your information. Certainly, and we know that the feds are tapping in even to the internet backbone that goes overseas and in the U.S., and depends how things bounce around through the internet. They are definitely collecting a lot of stuff. Veritas says Barr was also the top cop in charge of both Waco and Ruby Ridge. I did not know that. If anyone has a link to that, if you have a link to that, Veritas, feel free to post it in the chat here or email me over at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I think that's really interesting. Stephen RG said, I supported Trump till he did all the attacks on the Second Amendment and his support of red flag laws. Yeah, that stuff is so bad. Dan Reed, good to see you, buddy. If you guys have not seen it yet, Dan got me this awesome, I was a guest on the Culinary Libertarian podcast, and it was really cool for him to send this mug. It was culinarylibertarian.com/27. Michael Bolden guest. That was really cool. Thanks again for that, Dan. That was really awesome. He says, such a statement that mental illness might be from drug use expands the law to include and keep all drugs illegal. And of course, they want to do that. The more things that they are protecting you from, the more funding that they can steal from you, the more money they can steal from you, and the more power they get, and the more agencies they have, more people that become dependent on the government for their livelihood. A lot of interesting chat here. I think I'm just kind of scrolling through at this point. Clint says, got to run, and I probably should as well. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you learned something. It's certainly an outrage what's happening, but the more informed we are, the more that we can come up with strategies to oppose it. I think it is worth an episode or two to cover ways to opt out of these programs, to work with local communities or on the state level to try to undermine and nullify them. It's going to take a lot of work and a lot of persistence and consistency in the strategy, but let's talk about that as time goes. Again, thank you so much for joining me. If you support the show, smash the like, get notifications. Memberships are $2 a month to start out. It really helps us a lot. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I hope you have a great Monday. I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.